All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 36th Sustainable Agriculture Conference from the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. My name is Mary Beth Miller, CFSA's Education Coordinator, and I am thrilled to be able to introduce Jennie Love from Love and Fresh Flowers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And she's also the host of the No Till Flowers podcast. You joined the session Habitat Farming with Perennials for cut flowers. Please, if you would like to introduce yourself in the chat, please do so. And feel free to put your questions or your comments in the chat as well. Jennie can decide, how she wants to answer those throughout the session. I think there's going to be some time at the end for a little bit of Q&A as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Jennie.
Awesome. Thank you. I hope I just realized my internet connection was a little spotty there, so I hope I don't lose you guys. I'm sorry. Ironically, I'm in the city of Philadelphia and I have some of the worst internet connection just because there's so many people trying to get on the same sort of bandwidth here. Sometimes it gets grainy, especially in the middle of the morning when everybody's working from home. So I apologize in advance if it gets a little shaky, and hopefully Mary Beth can keep you all entertained if I disappear and have to come back on. So I'm really excited you're all here this morning and eager to learn about perennial production for cut flowers and foliage at your farm and how that can really enhance your overall farm ecosystem and what we can do in that format to basically help move the earth forward to regenerating poor landscapes and changing your farm's resilience and ability to withstand pests and diseases and frankly just crazy weather. So that's what we're here today to learn a lot about how perennials within your farm landscape can be a huge help on so many levels. So with that, I am going to go ahead and share my screen so that you guys can see what I've got in store for you here. So the title of this talk today is Habitat Farming with Perennials for Cuts. And this is basically what I do at my farm. So I'll give you a little overview of my farm, which is Love and Fresh Flowers, located here in Philadelphia. And so I'm north of most of you probably, but I suspect that there's people from maybe around the country for this talk. So I want you to understand how cuts can be a really important and valuable piece of your farm's income, and then it can really contribute to your farm's ecosystem. So when I say cuts, I'm talking about flowers and foliage, which are used for bouquet making and floral design and so forth. So that's the term that we use a lot in my industry. If you're a vegetable grower, just wanted to give you that terminology. So you'll see here is that this presentation is for the birds. So that's one of the main reasons I got so hooked on this concept of habitat farming, is because I noticed what a difference my farming practices made to the life of birds and the abundance of birds. So here in this shot, you'll see this little house wren hanging out over here. And they're now one of my favorite creatures to have at my farm. And this is a patch of dahlias. And we'll talk a little bit more about why this house wren in this photo is so critical to the health of my own farm and is a reflection of the health of the ecosystem overall. But I just wanted you to see like this actually in action, how growing perennialized flower and foliage crops can really help with habitat for birds, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, everybody else out there. There's a huge world of life around our farms and in our farms, and I want to help people understand and respect that and participate in it. So, but here's a look at what most farms look like, and yours may very well too. And I want you to understand that this presentation is no way meant to make any farmer feel bad about their farm. It's just a hard look through a lens of what our global farming culture is like currently. And hopefully I will be able to inspire you to make a few small changes on your farm, which often will lead to larger changes. So currently there are just under 5 billion acres on this planet's surface that are dedicated to agriculture, most of which is annual commodity crop production. And that's 38% of our Earth's surface. And this is often what it looks like, where it's just large, wide open spaces with crops that are constantly churning and turning, and lots of soil disturbance, or if it's not being disturbed, then it's in no-till production that uses chemicals. And so soil health really suffers, and habitat suffers tremendously. There's very little space here in this photo for all the wildlife that needs to exist in a space. And that wildlife is super, super important. I'm sure you all know, like, we are connected by threads, countless threads that we can't even begin to understand, woven together to support life on this planet. And as farmers, we often are just extracting from the landscape and rarely contributing back to the landscape. So we take way more from our farms than we put back into our farms. And so with perennials, particularly perennials for cut flower production and foliage, there's a lot of ways that we can give back to the ecosystem in a way that annual production really can't do. Particularly, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with vegetables, but a lot of times vegetable and commodity crop production really does remove lots of stuff from the ecosystem instead of giving back a lot of habitat. So in your farm space, you will be able to add and contribute with perennial production. And I want to teach you today some of the things that you can plant and the reasons why you would want to plant them. So let's go through the benefits of perennials out there in the landscape. So for those that, I'll start with really, really basic knowledge, just in case. Perennials are long-lived plants that tend to go into the ground and don't get removed from space very often. And so that is in contrast to annuals, which usually last or just there for one season, sometimes just really, really short cycles of 30 to 90 days. So at my farm, we do grow annuals still, but I try to put lots of perennials into production. So the benefits here are that they provide invaluable and really unique, more than anything, really unique ecosystem services that annuals just can't provide. And those include soil retention, because there's just going to be less disturbance to the soil. You plant them once, you're not going to have to plant them again. So you're not going to go around and around disturbing the soil. And then also the other reason there's more soil retention is because the root system of perennials tends to be much deeper than that of annuals. So when you get hard rains or heavy winds, then you're not losing nearly as much of that surface layer of soil, because the root systems of perennials are really going to hold on to it more. And then the other thing that perennials really do that annuals really quite can't do is just biota habitat. And by biota, I mean all life forms, both above the ground, below the ground. So we're talking microbes, we're talking mushrooms, and then, like I said, reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals, everything benefits from having more habitat from perennials. So that's what perennials can really provide that annuals often do not. I'm not saying that annuals can't provide any habitat. They certainly provide a lot of food sources for pollinators and other insects, but rarely do perennials provide a lot of habitat and food for birds and reptiles and other mammals as well. I suppose they certainly provide food for mammals. We all had groundhogs and rabbits go through our farms, but I'm saying just in the long term, perennials provide a lot more habitat. And then what I find really deeply gratifying and powerful about perennials is their ability to help us better cycle water, to do a more complete water cycling within the ecosystem of the farm, which ultimately ripples out to like our ocean water ultimately. So because of their deep root system, and also because they have branches, canopy out in the landscape a lot longer than annuals would, perennials tend to have a more complete water cycling function, where they slow down the rain when it falls onto the earth with all the branches and leaves that they have. And then they also cleanse that water more effectively down in the ground because of that deep root system that they have. So it helps hold on to the water in the soil longer. So instead of lots of runoff going into those streams and then into the oceans, perennials are going to really gather up that water. They're also going to gather up the excess nutrients a little bit more. So that is really one of their superpowers, I like to say. Then one of the things that perennials do is have greater diversity of plant species. There's just I don't even know the number of perennials, but if you only focus on annuals, there's only so many plant species you're going to put in there, particularly with more traditional agricultural production. You're really limited to very specific, potatoes or soybeans, that sort of thing. So you don't have nearly the diversity in your farm ecosystem if you're just focusing on annual production. When you introduce perennials as a crop, being, sort of switch your mind to this concept of I can add perennials to the space, you immediately get access to like thousands of new species that you might not otherwise have planted. So you're definitely going to increase diversity at your farm. And then also the thing that perennials tend to do is they create this multi-tiered canopy space where you have things lower to the ground, things mid-level, things taller, all the way up to trees. And it's that multi-tiered functionality in the ecosystem that really helps provide habitat. Ultimately, you've got shelter for the things right on the ground, shelter for the things that like to exist about hip high, shelter that likes, for things that like to be up, higher than your head, and so forth. And also perennials provide consistent canopy in the landscape, meaning branches and leaves, so that there's more time for residents to take up, space in them. So the birds and so forth, there's actually time for these other living beings in your farm ecosystem to realize, hey, this is a house and it's going to stay here for a while. So having that consistent canopy is what leads to better habitat at your farm. And then perennials, particularly native perennials, which we'll focus on here today, have this ability to be way more resilient in the face of wild weather swings. So I don't know about you guys, but Philadelphia this year was a crazy town roller coaster ride of weather. I think it's been across the country. We just had insane rainfall, which would come in huge dumping events where we would get 5 to 6 inches all at once. And then there'd be several weeks where we wouldn't get any rain. And so just this huge swing up and down, and that coupled with extreme heat. So these are the kind of conditions the annual crops just really can't get going in them, because they're either too little when that torrential rain comes down and then they get flooded out, or it's too hot and dry and then they dry out, that kind of thing. It's really hard for them, for annuals, to withstand crazy fluctuations in the climate. Versus perennials, this is what they were built for. They generally have co-evolved in the ecosystem with the soil life and with their friends around them, so the other plants that are around them. They've co-evolved to basically create microclimates for themselves where they can shelter in place and they can weather any storm, because that's just the way they were built. So the perennials are way more resilient and will help a farm and a farmer be more resilient in the long haul as well, which frankly, that's my biggest worry these days, is how can I actually keep farming for the next 20 years, because I'm not sure the weather is going to let us do that. So that's one of my big focuses is at my farm, is to try to figure out how we're going to do this for the long haul. And I think perennials are really the ticket to that. Perennials also, great superpower that they have is to be capable of growing in really less than prime agricultural land. So I'm going to guess all of you right now, just take a moment to think, what do you have around your farm that's not really being used in terms of space? There's almost always a woodlot or a sloped area or a rocky, really infertile space in the back 40 that's just getting no love. It's kind of a pain in your butt because you always have to like give it a little bit of thought, but it's not doing anything to produce for you. It's just it's a hurting landscape that needs attention, but frankly, who has the time? If it's not going to be a crop space, then you're not going to pay a lot of attention to it. So this is where perennials can be super helpful to turn that less than prime space into something that frankly can become really prime. Some of my most productive space at my farm is steeply sloped wooded area that basically you would never look at it and think of it as good farmland, but it is the best farmland I have because it's where these specialty crops, these special perennials want to grow, and they're high value crop. So that I'm jumping ahead a little bit there to my next bullet point, but usually perennial crops are specialty crops, and so they have a higher value for the harvest. So that's a really a nice little niche to get into is perennial production. And coupled with that on the other side of the equation is that they're less input intensive. So when you look at it overall, perennials tend to be much more profitable. There's actually a study done by the United Nations Food, something FOA. I can't remember what FOA stands for, but they did a study where they proved that perennial production was way more profitable than annual production on farms because of the fact of this equation where there's less input and a higher value harvest. So with less inputs, that means, just irrigation amendments, labor, fuel, all those things. Usually you plant a perennial once, you don't usually have to fertilize them. You rarely have to do anything except weed them, and then you harvest them, and you'll harvest from them for decades. So it's way, way, way less input intensive than an annual crop. So, and then that ultimately, as somebody who's over here who's been farming for my whole life and getting kind of tired and sore, that ultimately leads to less backaches and less sore knees, which for me is a big piece of the puzzle too, as I try to figure out how to farm into older age. So these are all the benefits of perennials, and hopefully they're ringing a few bells with you guys so you feel the excitement about what perennials can do in your space. So I want to just show you this real quick because this is a powerful indicator of what we should be doing in our landscape. So this was a study, and this is a great book, by the way, The Nature of Oaks. If anybody has time to read over the winter, I highly recommend it. But this is Doug Tomley he's a professor here at the University of Delaware near me, and he did a study recently where he looked at native oak trees in the mid-Atlantic region here in the US and found that there were over 500 species of caterpillars in one oak tree. Tended to be, I think he was studying white oaks at the time. So 500 species of caterpillars in an oak tree versus a ginkgo, which only had 5 species of caterpillars in it. So that is a 100-time difference there of how much essentially bird food is in that tree, because the caterpillars are food for the birds, and then the birds help with all the other ecosystem functions, and that is just a tiny encapsulation of a huge picture here of how valuable certain perennials, particularly native perennials, can be in our landscape. So if you can imagine just like a 1 mile stretch of the road leading up to your farm planted in ginkgos instead of oak trees, what that would do to the ecosystem. And then if you reverse that and you put a 1 mile stretch of oak trees leading up to your farm, what an abundance of life that's going to be. And that all translates into the same thing with these native crops that we're going to talk about here in this presentation as we move forward. So I just wanted you to have that nugget of information of how drastically different the selection of plants in your farm space can impact the overall habitat that you might have. So yeah, so what's better than a perennial? It's a native perennial. So here in this photo, I just wanted to show you, I focused on habitat farming at my farm for the past 3 years. I have been farming my space that I'm in right now for 13 years. But prior to switching to no-till eco farming practices, more natural farming practices, I was tilling, and I never used chemical sprays, but I was definitely more conventional for a decade. And then in 2018, I really switched my focus and started thinking a lot more about habitat, soil life. How could I put in features to increase bird life and so forth? So a part of that process was discovering box turtles on my property. So these are native eastern box turtles. They are a threatened species. They are losing habitat very quickly. And so once I discovered box turtles on my farm, I sort of had a wake up call of like, whoa, the things that I'm doing here, like every time I pull my tiller out, I am threatening chopping up this cute, adorable little thing here. This like baby box turtle. Oh my gosh. And every time I mow, I could possibly chop through a box turtle, that kind of stuff. It started to hit me like, wow, when I farm with like a heavy footprint, I impact so many other life forms versus if I can have a lighter footprint, if I can think through this about how to coexist with these other lives and then ideally help them flourish, then what, the amazing, beautiful, sort of upward spiral of health and wellness that comes out of that, both for them and for me. That's when I made my shift. So in about 2018, I kind of really triggered a lot of changes in my farming practices. And as a result, we've seen loads of baby box turtles born at my farm, which is a very rare thing to have mating box turtles. It takes box turtles 10 years to become old enough to even mate. And then it's very hard for males and females to find each other. And then it's equally hard for a pregnant female to find a good place to lay eggs. And even harder yet for that place to be safe enough that baby turtles can be born and actually age to the point where they could produce. So it's a very fragile system that box turtles exist in. And my farm is actually a phenomenal space. It's an urban farm. I have 6 acres that I'm stewarding in the city of Philadelphia. And I have such an opportunity to have an impact on this species, but many other species. So the reason native perennials in particular are so important is because they co-evolved with the local soil biology, soil types, and also the local wildlife, the creatures that are within that space. And it's those unique threads of connectedness that are absolutely irreplaceable. There's nothing else that can do the same thing for these creatures, both above ground and below ground, as the native species that they co-evolved with. We're talking about millennia here coming into play, where different traits emerged and were embraced and replicated, and so they're so entwined. There's no way anything you grow that's not native could even remotely replace that which is native. And then, like I said, the native perennials are highly adapted to the local climate, which will make them a lot easier to grow. I have a degree in horticulture, and through my horticulture education, I was drilled into my head, right plant, right place, which means there's certain plants that want to grow in certain spaces. And then if that plant doesn't want to grow in that space, it doesn't matter what you do, it's never going to be happy. So you should always try to find the right plant for the right space. And usually native perennials are almost always the right plant for the right space, as long as they're in their native habitat. And native perennials provide a much greater food source for insects, birds, mammals, reptiles, and fungi, which we're going to talk about here in a second. And then one of the things that's really magical, which I didn't even understand until I started going down this road myself about native perennials, is their ability to help reduce pests in a farm system. So I originally, back in the day, would spray organic, like insecticidal soaps and horticulture oils and so forth to try to control things like aphids at my farm. And I just can never seem to get ahead of that system. There was always a bloom of whatever pest before I they get it under control. Since focusing on habitat farming and encouraging all life forms at my farm, I have not sprayed since. Like, I've been able to completely stop spraying at my farm anything to do with pest control. And the reason for that is because now there's so much habitat for the birds and the predatory insects in particular, also the reptiles, that I don't have to do pest control anymore. And it's because I focused on those native perennials that really changed and turned the tide. Whoop. So here is just a quick study that I wanted to show you guys in case you wanted to reference some of this. There's lots of studies out there that have been done by mostly universities. There's one in Oregon, Michigan, and this happens to be one from California that have to do with the power of native plants for pest control. So here, this was a study done by the University of California where they did native hedgerows. They planted hedgerows, dense plantings of different size shrubbery that was native to California along the edges of tomato fields. And then they studied the number of beneficial insects out in those hedges and also the number of pests in the hedges. And then they also studied the number of beneficial insects in the tomatoes, within the tomatoes themselves, and the pests. And what they found is with the native hedgerows compared to whether it was the field's edge rows had been left unmaintained or they were weedy or whatever. Basically, when native hedgerows were present, there was a lot less pest pressure in the tomato fields. And that was because the native hedgerows were supporting parasitoid wasps in particular, which is, a huge beneficial insect for tomato production in particular. So there's this evidence, the scientific evidence that just backs up what I've just been able to witness myself at my own farm. There's observation and witnessing things changing in your own ecosystem, but then it's great to get the scientific verification. So here they found that native hedgerows could help crops that were up to 200 meters away from the native hedgerows to the point where they could reduce spraying of pesticides because those beneficial insects were coming into the field and really helping with that pest control. So it's pretty magical stuff. And I encourage you to, if you have some time this winter, to get a little nerdy and go down the rabbit hole of reading up about how native plantings encourage beneficial insects, and then that changes pest issues in the farm landscape. So while they were just in that study, they were really focused on parasitoid wasps. At my farm, I've been really focused on attracting birds because birds, I've noticed, particularly for cut flower production, and I'm going to guess for small scale vegetable production, sort of market garden style stuff, birds are hugely important to pest control. So in addition to planting perennials, I just wanted to give you an idea of a few other things that you should do to attract birds. And those are to put up bird boxes if you can, and then to put out water sources for birds. So basically at your farm, the three things birds need to come in droves and flourish and raise families is food, water, and shelter, just like human beings need. So you'll be providing the food naturally by just having a healthy landscape where they can graze at their leisure. But then you can also really help them out by providing some shelter and some water. So in this case, I have wren boxes. So that's a wren birdhouse hanging on my hoop houses. I have four wren boxes hanging on each of my hoop houses because the wrens love to go in and out of the hoop houses, and they clean up all my pests inside of my hoop houses. And then they also go out to the field and help with pest pressure out there. But I've specifically hung them on my hoop houses and have just been amazed at the amount of pest control I'm getting from just encouraging little wrens to come into the house. By the way, for anybody worried about birds that are going to graze on seeds, there are definitely loads of birds that graze on seeds, but there's many species of songbirds, such as wrens, mockingbirds, catbirds, that only that are 100% carnivorous. So they will only eat insects. I suppose maybe they'll eat like snakes and worms too, but basically they're not going to eat your seeds. So if you focus on drawing in the birds that are carnivorous, then you won't have to be as worried about seed predation. So in this capacity, wrens are very carnivorous. They are very active birds, and they raise 3 broods per season. So they'll have 3 sets of babies per season, and they usually have 3 to 4 babies per brood if they're successful. So that means over the course of 1 year, one growing season at my farm, two mating wrens can come in, and end up producing 12 new little wrens for me. And each one of those little wrens turns into a pest control friend. And so by the end of the season, what was 2 is now 14 little birds in total, and they are all doing pest control for me. And so by setting up so many wren boxes around the farm, I now have literally an army of wrens. Like, they're just always out there doing their thing. As you saw in that first slide with the dahlias and the little house wren sitting on the stake, that's what they do all day long, is just they're out there eating bugs for me, for themselves, and it helps me. I'm lucky that way. And it's because I put up wren boxes like this. And then the other thing is just putting up a bird bath. I have several bird baths around the farm. I want to put in a pond too, because that would be the ultimate helpful way of providing water for them, is a more natural water source. But for now, we've got bird baths around the farm, and that really helps them stay clean and healthy, which is why they're getting baths. But also, it's a water source, so birds can eat more bugs when they've got water to drink it down. It's like you and I trying to eat a cheeseburger real fast without, something to drink. Well, you're going to go slower if you don't have anything to drink with it. But if you got a cup next to you, you can go much faster on that cheeseburger. So that's the exact same thing that birds need in general. Is if you want them to be really efficient at bug control, then you need to provide them with water as well. So plus they're just so darn cute. They're so fun to have around the farm. So here's a picture of me in my dahlia field, part of my dahlias. And I put this up here because I wanted you to see this giant hydrangea hedge over here on the side. I started planting hedgerows through my field. Hydrangeas aren't native, but it is a fantastic cut flower. And I did that on purpose. I put them right next to my dahlias, so that dahlias are one of the highest value crops that I grow at my farm. And they're also tend to be an absolute pest magnet for flower producers. So I'm not sure what the equivalent is in the vegetable world, but if you're a flower grower, you know the nightmare that is pest control in dahlias. It's just usually a nonstop war where you have everything wants to eat dahlias, grasshoppers, every kind of beetle, aphids get on them, slugs get on them, everything wants to eat the dahlias. And so usually most growers have to do a tremendous amount of work to just control pests. And that might be spraying a lot, or it could be exclusionary practices such as putting little tiny organza bags on every single dahlia in the field to stop the beetles from eating them. So that's really not cost productive or cost effective. It's very emotionally draining as well. The fight can be just like utterly exhausting, emotionally exhausting to the farmer. And usually a lot of flower farmers will just want to give up on dahlias and find them to be the hardest thing to grow because of that. So I was in that same boat myself, absolutely, at one point. And then I decided to do two things. I perennialized my dahlias. That's a whole nother subject, probably for a whole nother presentation. But I perennialized my dahlias instead of digging them up every year. So by leaving them in the ground now, they are acting as a perennial plant in my landscape. If anybody wants to learn more about that, I do have a blog post at loveandfreshflowers.com that's all about no dig dahlias is what it's called, if you want to look that up. So once the plants were perennialized, that helped the ecosystem stabilize, which was tremendous. And then I also planted these bushes around the farm within the sort of annual production space. I started putting shrubs in that space to create habitat for birds. So once I did that, both the two things, perennialize the dahlias and put in shrubs nearby, I now have literally zero pest pressure on my dahlias. It's kind of the most magical thing ever. And it's just a sample of the power of focusing on a perennial system versus an an annual system, and then including habitat for birds in this space. So now birds go in and they eat all the cucumber beetles, they eat all the Japanese beetle, they eat all the grasshoppers. And then they also, in the spring, they're going down for the slugs. There's this bird called a brown thrasher. The brown thrashers come in the spring and they're going for the slugs below, under the straw and the leaves and so forth. So it's phenomenal to see the change in this space. And I wanted you guys to sort of have a brief glimpse at that. And here's a few more pictures of my farm. This is just an indication of so this is my annual field. This is a field that is dedicated to annual production by and large. But then down the center of this field, over here on the right is the white stuff is hydrangeas that are in bloom. And then there's another row of shrubs going down here that just looks all green because it's not in flower at the moment. And those are both hedgerows that are specifically placed to create basically habitat and safety and a runway for birds and other amphibians and reptiles to go through this space and feel safe from predators, because there's a lot of hawks that fly over my farm. So they want to have safe shelter from that. So by introducing these hedgerows going right down through the middle of my annual production space, I've been able to see a great reduction in pests. And then also there's been a lot of windbreaks. So I think, as probably other presenters have talked about in this conference, wind has a huge impact on soil life and soil health. So if you've got wind just whipping across your property, which I always did prior to putting in more hedgerows, wind whipping across the property dries out the soil and therefore desiccates soil life, really harms soil biology. And then when the soil biology slows down, that means that the sort of energy flow within the space where the photosynthesis of the plants is feeding the soil life, and then the soil life feeds the plants, that cycle gets, the brakes get put on it really hard, and then your crops will suffer ultimately. So you want to think about wind movement across your property, and these hedgerows, these plantings of shrubs, can be hugely helpful with managing air movement. And so, if you're a vegetable farmer, this could be hard to think about, how am I going to put shrubs into my otherwise really, high value cropland? And I want to encourage you to maybe consider some ornamental shrubs that you can sell the cuts from instead. So that's what we're going to talk about here. And this is just another quick photo this was actually taken by Jesse Frost from No Till Growers, who was visiting my farm last week, and he was a presenter here in the conference just the other day. But this is a picture of one of my fields that's dedicated to production of perennials shrubbery. So all of these rows here are perennial shrubs that are going to create amazing habitat over time for decades to come. So just a quick look at what that looks like on the ground, so to speak. All right, so now let's go through. I just want to make sure I don't go on for too long and not have time for questions. So we're going to go through 15 of my favorite native perennial plants for either flower production or foliage production. So we've also got some stuff that makes berries in here as well, like you see with the aronia here. But what you can do with this, if you're not already in this farming space of cut flowers and foliage, the things I'm going to talk about now are high value cuts that could be sold to florists in your area. So maybe you don't want to necessarily become a flower farmer and get into flower farming per se. You want to keep your farm ecosystem similar, or your crop plan similar, maybe not your ecosystem. You're going to change your ecosystem quite a lot, hopefully, but maybe you don't really want to bring on this whole other enterprise to your farm. But you can plant these and then hopefully find even just one florist in town that would want to buy this stuff from you, and it will be a really great additional cash flow for your farm, even if it doesn't become a flower farm. And so we're just going to run through all these, and then in the Q&A portion, please ask me any questions you have about how you would actually use any of these things. So, all right, so aronia is also known as chokeberry sometimes, and this is a very poor picture of it, but I didn't think to take a picture of it until right before this conference. And so this is a plant after it's been chopped up quite a bit this season, but they have glossy green leaves in the summertime, which is really great for bouquet making and floral design. And then they get scarlet red foliage in the autumn, which is also fantastic for floral design. And then they have these beautiful red berries, which are both edible, so you can make jams, compotes, and juices out of aronia berries. Apparently, I have not gotten into that segment of the market, but I've heard that it's actually quite a valuable crop for that as well on its own. But they're also decorative, so you can use them in design work as well. And florists would really enjoy having those to work into their Thanksgiving arrangements. Frankly, it's right now is the time of year that those look really their best. Um, Even if you don't want to grow them particularly for cutting, aronia is one of the toughest plants I know. It will adapt to just about anything. I have it in really poor soil in the back 40, a place that basically nothing else was going to grow. It's thriving there. It also handles poor drainage and shade, et cetera, et cetera. So it does great in those marginal spaces at your farm where nothing else is going to really grow. And of course, with all these gorgeous berries on there, it is a fantastic food source for birds, especially migrating birds that might be going through your farm in late autumn and need a little something to sustain themselves. So that's why you'd want to grow aronia. It can get to small tree size. Should have included this on the slide. Sorry, guys. Small tree size, so it's kind of like ultimately about the size of like a dogwood or something, not a big towering tree, but small tree size if you let it grow unchecked. All right, so next one up is one of my very favorites. This is arrowwood viburnum or viburnum dentatum. It gets its name, arrowwood, because it was used by indigenous people to create the shafts of arrows because it has such perfectly straight, slender branches. It was the exact thing that they needed for arrow shafts, and that's why it has its common name. As a flower farmer, I love it because it is one of the hardest working shrubs that I grow. It has flower buds in the spring, which make for the great fillers. So that's what's pictured here, these lovely little flower buds. They come at a time when you don't have enough stuff to make bouquets with. And so it's really fantastic for spring bouquet making. Those that are already making bouquets in the spring know how hard it is to find something to fill in bouquets. And arrowwood viburnum is just the ticket for that. And then through the summertime, it has glossy green leaves that hold up really well in arrangements and a little bit out of water. Not super great for complete, like full day design work at a wedding without water, but they do have really nice glossy green leaves that we use tons and tons of stems in all of our design work with that. Then it also, all of these, if you didn't cut all of these little flower buds that you see in this photo, they would turn into colorful fruit in the autumn. So they have different varieties that are blue or orange or red. So you get really pretty, some of you may be familiar with cranberry viburnum. Cranberry viburnum is a viburnum dentatum. It's a variety of this, and so you can get the fruit in the fall as well. And so that makes it what I call a triple threat, where you have something you can cut from it all season long. It is such a productive plant. We just chop and chop and chop off of it, and they don't seem to mind at all. They tolerate poor soils, but they do generally need to be in full sun to be as productive as possible. But they're very good in poor soils, and they make excellent bird habitat. So these get quite bushy. They're very sort of thick, dense plants, and they do get to be about, I think, 15 feet tall at maturity. So it's a really great space for birds. They love viburnum. They make nests and they hang out in there. So it's a great one if you want to attract more birds to your space. So next one up is bush honeysuckle or Daravilla. This is a lower growing shrub, so I wanted to give you guys some ideas of various canopies, that multi-tiered canopy system that I'm talking about. It's good to have things at different heights. So this one is more like about knee to waist high, Daravilla is. It has small yellow flowers early in the spring, which can be used for fillers and bouquets. And then it has a deep green. There's different cultivars. This one here is Kodak Orange, I think, Kodiak Orange, but I grow several different varieties. So in the springtime, they have varying shades of deep green foliage, which is really great for bouquet making as well. And then this is a photo here of it in the autumn, and it gets really beautiful venation. So the veins turn colors in the autumn, and it also takes on a darker tone to the foliage. And then it has really beautiful seed heads as well. So all of that is great for design work, bouquet making, or if you're selling to a florist, they would love this for autumn weddings in particular. So that's its value as a crop. And then its value in the habitat is that it's great, particularly for those smaller creatures out there. So snakes, turtles, toads, salamanders, that kind of stuff. They all love to hang out under the Daravilla. And if you're freaking out about the concept of snakes, fortunately, I'm lucky I farm in Pennsylvania and there really aren't very many poisonous snakes that would show up at my farm. So I'm a big like, yay, snakes fan. But I realize there are places, I'm not sure about in the Carolinas, how many poisonous snakes you have. I know there's some places like, snakes can definitely be terrifying, but having the right kind of snakes around can be hugely helpful for mole and vole populations. Even some baby rabbits sometimes will go the way of snakes, and then slugs in particular. My farm struggles with slugs. So the more snakes and amphibians and reptiles I can get around my farm, the better that slug control is. So that's one reason I'm always focused on bringing as many snakes into my space as I can. And it's because of the suckering habit of this plant that the little guys, the little creatures on the ground love it so much, because it creates a thicket on the ground itself, which gives them a lot of shelter from predators and a lot of places to hunt, particularly things like salamanders really like that space. And it's this suckering habit of this plant that makes it such an abundant plant. Like we can just cut like crazy from this plant without hurting the plant at all. But it can be a little aggressive if you're not harvesting from it regularly. So that's just a heads up. Like if you want to plant this, but you're not planning on really like, turning it into a crop, you're just going to put it in a space so that it creates habitat, then be aware that it'll go wherever it wants to go. So put it somewhere that it won't start taking over your valuable cropland. So that is Daravilla. Then we've got summer sweet or clethra. This has a sweetly fragrant flower spike that you see here in the photo in midsummer. So it's just such a gorgeous, gorgeous scent. And it's really nice to include, particularly in wedding design work, is what I do. So at my farm, the majority of my crops, my flower production is going into wedding designs. And then also, clethra provides really nice foliage in late summer and autumn, which can be used in bouquet making for farmers markets and so forth as well. What's really nice about clethra is it can handle those super marginal spaces around your farm, like anywhere that is wet, there's poor soil, it's shady, rocky, all of that stuff. Clethra will handle any of that and just thrive. So it's a good one. You can even put it like along the woodland edges and so forth. Like one of the places that I'm using it is this area in what I call my back 40, which was just an overgrown crazy mess of multiflora rose and wild grapevine, bittersweet. It was just this tangled ball of vines that had scrambled over old, weary black cherry plants that were barely alive and so forth. It was truly just a mess. So it took a while to clear that, and I wanted to sort of, once it was cleared, I wanted to get something in there that would really take hold and change the ecosystem instead of just letting all that stuff come back that had been there. And so clethra is one of those, along with Itea that we're going to talk about, that just was able to immediately grab hold and is a fast grower. So it is able to outcompete some of those nasties that I had to take out of there. But that means that it is a bit of an aggressive plant itself. So if you're not going to harvest from it regularly, bear that in mind, but you should just harvest from it and sell the cuts off of it instead. So here's its partner, Virginia Sweetspire or Itea. Itea is the Latin name. And this isn't the best picture of it because we've harvested off of it heavily, and this was just taken the other day, but it's a really beautiful, one of those sort of mid-level tiered canopy shrubs that gets to be about hip high when it's fully mature. And it has these gorgeous arching stems, which you can kind of see in this photo. It's a really nice arching shape, which is beautiful in design work in particular. And so in the spring, it gets small fragrant flowers, which is why it has its name, Sweet Spire. Those are pretty they're not overly noticeable. We do use them some for design work, but they're not like a showy flower at all. When we use them, we're using them mostly for the fragrance. So we use them in wedding designs where fragrance really counts. So that's not generally what we're growing them for. We're growing them for the foliage. So the foliage is a beautiful glossy green in the summertime, and it turns this deep burgundy, purple, reddish color in the autumn, a big hit when we're doing anything to design with. What's really special about ITEA is it's very happy in the shade and it tolerates poor soils. So it's a great one to put in those spaces. It's hard to grow anything else. And again, like its friend Clethra and Durabella, it does have a suckering, spreading habit. So make sure you keep harvesting it to keep it in check, or put it someplace you don't mind if it runs. All right, next up is false indigo, one of my very favorite native perennials to grow. Baptisia is its Latin name. So you can see over here in this picture just how gorgeous that is. So those are the flower spikes in the springtime, usually in May, which is great for putting into bouquet work in the spring when you don't have a lot of other stuff just yet. It's one of the earlier blooming perennials at my farm. And then we harvest the foliage all summer long as well to use in bouquets and design work too. So it's really great for foliage. And then if you don't manage to cut off all the flowers in your greed in the spring, which is really hard not to take them all in the spring, you'll have seed heads in the fall, pretty black seed heads in the fall, which are also great for floral design work. So the magic of Baptisia is that it has a very deep taproot system, mostly taproot. It's also got other fibrous roots too, but very deep. Basically, once you plant Baptisia, you'll never be able to dig it up because it has such a deep taproot. But what's so great about that is it's really channeling down to mine up minerals from the soil down below, where none of the other taproot or none of the other root systems around your farm are going to be able to go. It also helps with water filtration down to the subsoil. And then it's also a nitrogen fixer. It's in the pea family. So it's going to fix nitrogen into your soil, which is going to help, shift the ecosystem down in the soil and ultimately make for healthier soil life overall. So that is Baptisia's number one superhero power. And then it's also very drought tolerant and long lived. It'll be, it's basically like you're going to be able to use it for the rest of your farming career. And it's just an incredibly tough plant. Like this stuff will survive anything. And that is why I have hundreds of Baptisias planted around my farm, because it's just such an easy plant to grow. There's basically no pests, no diseases, nothing. It's just fantastic. Easy care plants to grow and super productive. Like you make lots of money off of Baptisia because of that. And it's just in terms of habitat, it's this great mid-level canopy for bird shelter. So it gets about hip high, and it's a really leafy. It's not technically a shrub; it's an herbaceous perennial, but it looks like a shrub. So it's just a very leafy, full, bushy plant. And the birds absolutely love it. And they really enjoy being able to hang out on the ground under it. So there's certain bird species that love to dig through the ground, dig through the soil for bugs, like that brown thrasher that I mentioned earlier. And catbirds are really into that too. So they appreciate the sort of the framework of this plant in particular, because they can get under there and hunt underneath of them without worrying about getting swept up by a hawk. So that is great for those birds. So this is Joe Pye weed, Eupatorium. It's a beautiful lavender pink flower, like you can see here in the photo, which really is great. It comes on in late summer and early autumn. if you sell to florists, they're going to gobble this up because it's just so special and unique compared to anything else they can get. You can also harvest the foliage once the plants are established, and early summer is a good time to harvest for bouquet making, but you don't want to take too much foliage off of them because then you won't get the flowers. So generally speaking, we're growing this mostly for the flowers. This variety pictured in my favorite one to grow is called Little Joe. So it's different than the giant towering straight species of Joe Pye weed, which is so big that it could really overwhelm your growing space unless you've got lots of stuff, lots of area that you're trying to just get something to grow in. So I recommend planting Little Joe because it's a better behaved variety. And what's great for habitat wise about this one is it's just such a major pollinator plant. Like it is swarming with all sorts of moths and butterflies and bees. And even hummingbirds come to this one as well because they love it so much. So this is a really good one to include for them. The Little Joe cultivar gets about hip high at best. Sometimes it's even as short as knee high, but it's still tall enough for a good cut variety. And then Joe Pye weed loves wet spots. So if you've got a wet spot around your farm, in addition to planting blueberries, which is always a good idea, you should definitely consider planting Joe Pye weed because it loves wet spots. All right, and here's another one of my favorites. This is spotted bee balm or Monarda puncta punctata. Sorry. Sometimes when I get rolling, it's hard for me to pronounce things, but it's pictured here. It's just such a beautiful plant, right? It's one of my very favorite things to grow. There are many species of Monarda, so this just happens to be my favorite species because it's a native to the prairies of the Midwest. And so it's just really adapted to sort of harsher conditions. So it loves to be in poor soils and disturbed soils, rocky spaces. It does well in all that. It's very drought tolerant. It's a beautiful material to use in floral design work because it's fragrant and it's just super unique looking. There's nothing else that looks like this. So for that reason, it's a high value crop. And then in terms of habitat, it is definitely like a huge draw for predatory insects, so parasitoid wasps and so forth. And then also, I noticed mine are absolutely covered in blue mud wasps, which are a wasp that hunts spiders. And it's a harmless wasp. So it's a really good way to draw in some of those predatory beneficial insects for your ecosystem so that they can help fight your pests in your farm. So that is spotted bee balm. And then goldenrod, solidago. Probably most of you have seen this out in meadow spaces. It's a wonderful native plant. It has a lot of value as a crop. So you can harvest the foliage in early summer, which is beautiful for putting in bouquets. And then my favorite stage for it is the green bud stage, which comes mid to late summer, where it's just like a chartreuse color before it actually opens up into the golden stage. It's amazing foliage and filler for bouquets at that stage. It just really fluffs up bouquets. And then also obviously this gorgeous open golden flower in late summer, early autumn comes at the perfect time to make bouquets as well that look very seasonal and autumnal. A lot of times people will blame solidago for seasonal allergies, and I just want to tell you right now that that doesn't happen. The pollen is too heavy to carry on the wind, so the pollen would just drop straight to the ground. It would never go in the wind. So it's not causing our noses to clog up and us to sneeze. What's doing that is a friend of it's that grows right next to goldenrod all the time, which is called ragweed, and that is the culprit. But solidago unfortunately has gotten a bad rap for causing allergies. So if you're trying to sell it to people and they're going to tell you, oh, I can't have that because it makes me sneeze, I just wanted to equip you with the knowledge right from the start that that is false information. So, and to that end, the solidago is an amazing space for beneficial insects. So it needs to be insect pollinated. since its pollen is too heavy to float on the wind, it relies on pollinators, and that's why you'll just see myriad pollinators and beneficial insects in there. So this is another one that draws in parasitoid wasps in particular, and I think green lacewings come to this one too. So definitely include this in your landscape, and it just it thrives in like all the marginal spaces, like poor dry soil, rocky, like it just takes whatever it can get. And I find it's actually best to just leave it grow wild instead of trying to crop it per se. Anytime I've tried to crop it, it doesn't do well. So instead, I just give it a space and let it do whatever it wants to do over there. Right. So brown-eyed Susans, or Rudbeckia triloba, is one variety of a of a black, a native black-eyed Susan, and it has this profusion of these beautiful yellow ray flowers, which are great for attracting pollinators in particular, and it also gives seeds for birds in the fall when they're migrating through, which is great. It is an excellent contributor to soil community with its fibrous root system, for sure. And it will tolerate a wide range of soils, and I have it in light shade, so it does really well in that. I'm going to go a little faster because I'm realizing I'm going too long here, and I want to get time for questions. So here's another one, beard tongue penstemon. It has this beautiful spike flower, a major food source for hummingbirds that are migrating through, and it also obviously attracts loads of pollinators because of that tubular bright colored flower. It comes in lots of different colors. We use this for flowers only. We don't use it for anything else, but it tolerates light shades, and it's also really good at handling woodland edges and sort of lots of different soil conditions, and it'll spread and naturalize when it's happy. And here's Phlox paniculata. It's probably one of the showiest native flowers that you can grow. It's an excellent cut flower. It comes in a wide range of colors. Florists will really like this if you're selling this to florists. It's a big place for hummingbirds and pollinators and birds to get food from the seed heads for the birds in particular. So that's great for that. And it tolerates light shade. In fact, in hot summer climates like you'd have in the Carolinas, it would prefer to have some shade. So it's nice to have that in your back pocket for those. And then we're going to wrap it up here with some grasses, because grasses are, support a whole different framework of the ecosystem. So this is northern sea oats. We use the green seed heads for cutting in late summer, and then this beautiful golden seed head is what comes in the fall, and you can use it as fresh or dried. This particular ornamental grass grows really well in the shade, so it's a good one to put to your woodland edges. In fact, I'd recommend growing it in shade. It will grow very well in sun, but it will become kind of an out of control thug in the sun. So I recommend planting it in the shade. It also is really happy to go in wet spots, but it will do fine in dry spots as well. And like all grasses, it has a great root system for holding on to soil and then building soil over time because it's photosynthesizing so rapidly when it's happy. And one of the great things about this is it will outcompete some of those thugs, the invasive thugs that you don't necessarily want to have around your property. So it's good for that. And it will also even grow under black walnuts. So that may be its best attribute yet. And then this is the last one here, blue stem Indian grass. It just has gorgeous plumes that you can harvest and sell it tolerates heavy clay and poor soils, and it can grow in some shade and under black walnuts as well. So it has all those same attributes as the previous one, northern sea oats. And the birds in particular love the seed heads of these in late autumn, like the goldfinches come in to gather up what they can from that. So there you go. So this is a little salamander. Salamanders are an indicator species that tells you that your landscape is healthy and whole and functioning on all cylinders, so to speak. So if you start finding salamanders around your farm, and toads as well are another one, then you know you're doing a good job. So look for those, and just try to increase habitat on your farm. I encourage you to think more about your farm as a whole ecosystem instead of just this place for economics, so to speak, of what can you grow and what can you sell. And here's just, you can find more of these kind of things from my podcast, No Till Flowers, and I'm also over on Instagram at No Till Flowers if you want to follow along there, where I get nerdy all the time. But now I want to open it up for questions because I'm really eager to hear what you guys have to say. So yeah, let's do that. I'm going to go to, I guess it's just easiest, Mary Beth, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, to just go to the chat function and see if there's, or should we just have people, talk? What do you prefer?
I think we had some questions at the very beginning. I know like there's a lot in the chat, so I was having to scroll up. Someone did ask about plants that will survive and thrive with wet feet. So if there's an area where there isn't a lot of, well, I'll just read it. She says, we have an area in the power line easement that's super boggy due to the power company tearing out all the vegetation. Is there something that can help with erosion and also make that area profitable? So something that can work with and thrive with wet feet.
Yeah, definitely. Some of those ones I just mentioned there, in particular, like northern sea oats would be great for that. I would put aronia in there. I'd probably put a whole mix of some of the things that I just went through there, because that'll create a lot of different root systems in this same space, and you'll be able to cut from all of those then. So definitely sea oats, itea would do well, clethra will do well, aronia will do well. So just I think you guys will have access to this presentation after this, so you'll be able to review those notes. But a lot of those that I said would do great in that space, and I think that's a wonderful way to put that space to use and help. So yeah, definitely. I can go through here, Mary Beth, if you want me to, if that's easier. Okay, so next was a question: is it okay to use USDA assessed HEL or UHEL solids for perennial production? I don't, so I'm guessing that's like humanure. I don't know those terms in particular, but since perennials, if you're using ornamental perennials, so cut flower perennials or cut foliage like we were talking about today, that is not a food source for humans. So to my understanding, there are no regulations whatsoever about what can be applied to perennials that are just being used for cutting to sell to florists and so forth. So yeah, and
that was Jenny, that was my question.
Okay. Yeah.
That's highly erodible land, or unutilized highly erodible land.
Gotcha. Are you in a conservation plan then or something? Is that what you're worried about?
Well, I discovered after I bought my farm that somebody had about like 10 of the 13 acres assessed as being highly erodible.
Oh,
so I'm
wow.
trying to figure out what I can do with them.
Yes, so I would think so. I mean, I don't have particular authority to say this is okay, but a large portion of my own farmland is highly sloped and was put into conservation because they didn't want it to erode. It wasn't necessarily USDA conservation, and I am able to plant these crops on there because it's considered a way of actually stabilizing the soil. So I think you'll be fine in that capacity, and then that way you'll be able to harvest from them. Yeah. And I'm looking at your second half of your question there, George, just to make sure I hit it all. If I harvest plants annually, do you still get the same benefit? Yeah, so that's a really good question. So George asked if you're harvesting from these plants, are you still getting the same benefits? Yeah, so my recommendation is to only harvest about a third of the plants in total. You can harvest the flowers to some capacity, but try not to take the canopy off of the plant. So try not to take too much of the actual leaves and stems and so forth, more than a third, because then if you do, you tend to limit the plant's ability to photosynthesize and contribute to that whole habitat ecosystem thing that we've got going on. You can cut more aggressively from these plants if you're more in it for like quote unquote just production, you know, that at a certain point it becomes extraction instead of collaboration with the ecosystem. So you can harvest more heavily, but at my farm I try to just do about 1/3 of the plant comes off for us to sell, so we can keep the farm profitable and the space productive, and then we leave 2/3 for the ecosystem. So yeah, that was a great question to ask, George.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jenny.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the questions. I'm just going to scroll through then and check on. Is Kendra my Kendra? I don't know if that's Kendra that I know, but if it is, hi Kendra. Okay, so anyone else want to grow every single one of these with me? Good, Ashley, I'm glad. But there are a lot of ideas to be had here for adding stuff. All right, let me get some more questions here. Where can we find all these plants? Do you grow your own transplants? This is a question from Katie. Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't grow my own transplants. A lot of these plants are really hard to grow from seeds. A lot of perennials, generally speaking, have very special, unique sort of requirements for getting the seed to germinate. So stratification or scarification, or they need like, 2 years to lay dormant and then they'll pop up, all this stuff. Way too complex, generally speaking. You can try it, but I would recommend buying transplants instead from a wholesaler. So if you've got a farm EIN, you can generally set up an account with a wholesaler and then get these plants much cheaper. So one of the places I get a lot of my shrubs, so things like aronia and the viburnums, the Daravilla, that kind of stuff, is a wholesale nursery out in Michigan called Spring Meadow Nursery. They're an excellent company to work with. So that's Spring Meadow out in Michigan. They will have plugs or liners of these plants that are relatively pretty affordable. Generally speaking, you can get most of them for anywhere from $2 to $3, sometimes $4 per a small little plug, a liner. So that means you can, with just a couple $100, you can really get several of, a lot of these plants going. And so that's a great way to go. And then also a lot of the herbaceous perennials like mountain mint and baptisia and things like that, I get from a company, a nursery here in Pennsylvania called North Creek Nurseries, and they specialize in native perennials, and an excellent company to work with as well. So that's North Creek Nursery for more of the herbaceous, smaller perennials, not the woody stuff. Good question, Katie. I love all your comments over here, guys. That was great. I wish I could have been participating right in the moment. Scotty and Donna asked, are there any of these wasps that several attract the squash vine borer variety? I don't want to attract those. Yeah, so I don't grow squash myself, so I'm not a vegetable farmer myself, but generally the wasps that that are being attracted to these plants are predatory wasps. There's all these studies, and like I indicated in that study from the University of California, and then there's several other ones online that you should be able to look up if you want to go down that rabbit hole. By and far, these plants are attracting predatory wasps, and those predatory wasps are going to be able to probably handle, the squash vine borer once it's, the caterpillar of it and stuff. So but again, I am no vegetable grower. I know very little about vegetable growing. So that's just take that as like, oh, you could do a little research, and I'm pretty sure the answer is they will not be attracting the pest variety. Let's see, keep scrolling. Ashley said, I had a hard time getting these little brown-eyed Susans to germinate, but once it did, whoa, mama, it keeps coming back with zero effort. Yep, that is Rudbeckia triloba for you in a nutshell. And I started with plants first because, yeah, I've tried to germinate them in the past and it's hard, but then they self-seed around and they just go bonkers. And a lot of times I think these perennials don't want human intervention. Like that's one of the reasons they're really hard to start from seed, is because we're not nature. I mean, we're part of nature, but nature has it all sorted out, and when we try to step in and do it ourselves, we just screw up the process. So it's better to just let nature do it. So I'm reading a question or comment from Jason about how it's hard to find some of these. I do a lot of sales of native plants I grow on my farm, and often I have to search deep on the internet to find seeds. Yeah, again, I would just encourage you to check out those 2 suppliers for plants. So that's, again, Spring Meadow Nurseries and North Creek Nurseries. All right. I'm just scrolling through. Yeah, I love that you guys are over here having these great chats. So good work, everyone. So Scotty and Donna ask, any thoughts on sugarcane plum grass, Saccharum giganteum? I have not grown that at all, so I don't have any experience with it. So if it has a nice plume, so in terms of does it have value for cutting? If it has a nice plume, like you saw there in the very last plant I presented, which was the Indian blue stem grass, if it's something like that, then yeah, florists will love that. So yeah, I would just cut it and see. So Kendra's not the Kendra I know. Kendra I know is in Tennessee, but I'm delighted you're here, Kendra. Great. Oh, thank you, Katie, for popping up links to Spring Meadows and North Creeks there. All right. Oh, Banner, yeah, Banner Greenhouses is in North Carolina. I forgot about that. I'm not sure how many native varieties they grow, but Banner is an awesome source for plants in general. All right, so Lisbeth said, how many seasons are you waiting for harvesting for flowers and foliage for woody perennials? That's an excellent question. So these are a bit of an investment in terms of time. So generally speaking, a lot of things you can't harvest from until maybe about year 3. They are perennials, and the saying for perennials is the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. So usually it's the 3rd year they jump up and they start doing their thing. So usually you have to wait about 3 years for them to get really productive, but you can start cutting a little bit off of them in the 2nd season. Kendra said, any tips on making initial contact with florists or even grocery stores? Thanks. Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily sell these particular crops to a grocery store because I don't think you're going to get the value for them that you would want to get for them. They're definitely a high value crop. So I would sell them instead to florists, in which case you just want to, when you have them ready, when they look good, cut them at their prime, so to speak, and take them into the florist. The best way to make friends with a florist is to show up with what you want to sell them. And usually you tend to give them the first bunch as like a sample, maybe take them a bucket of a bunch of different little things. The reality is that most florists are not going to know what these crops are that we just talked about today, because they're just not available in the market. Like their regular wholesaler where florists are going to get their flowers and their foliage won't carry any of this stuff. But I guarantee you, once they get their hands on it and they see it and they feel it and they use it in design work, they are going to be utterly hooked. This is like drugs for florists. So so the best thing you're going to do is just go into their shop or give them a call or an email, introduce yourselves, and then actually give them some freebies, let them play with them, and then I am absolutely certain they're going to come back to you after that. So yeah, so just to follow up, Kendra said, it feels intimidating because they're already getting the items they need, but they're not getting these items. Nobody's selling them these things. So that's what makes it so special and unique. And that's why you won't have to go in feeling intimidated that you're going to have to compete with every other source of cut stuff out there, because you're going to have something different than everybody else. All right. Katie asked, if you could only choose 3 of the plants you suggested, what would you pick? Oh boy, that's tough. Do I have to? No, just kidding. I will. Okay, so I would probably personally pick Daravilla, that bush honeysuckle. It's just so productive. It doesn't take up a lot of space as long as you're continue cutting from it. Now remember, you're going to have to cut from it, but it doesn't take up a lot of space in terms of needing lots of acreage. So Daravilla, the bush honeysuckle, I'd probably also put in Baptisia personally, because it's one of those what we call triple threat plants where it has flowers, it has foliage, it has seed heads. So you can get a lot off of those plants throughout the whole season. And then I would personally pick arrowwood viburnum, Viburnum dentatum, but it is a really big plant. So I don't know, Katie, if you're trying to stay in literally a small space, it could overwhelm that small space, but it is such a productive plant that if I was only having to choose 3, that would be the one that I would choose. If you're trying to stick to a small space and a big giant shrub like viburnum isn't going to happen for you, then I would probably pick, if I had to pick, man, that's tough. I'd probably go with phlox would be my other one then if you're staying in a smaller space. All right, so Elizabeth said, how are you choosing colors and varieties when predicting 3-ish years out? So you'll notice that a lot of these crops that I talked about here are foliage. So there's nothing to predict, they're always going to be useful in whatever is going to happen. And then, it's colors do cycle around some, but generally speaking, there's always a market for color of any kind. So the only plant that you'd really maybe like have to carefully consider the colors for, and the ones that I presented here, is the phlox. So in which case, just you can plant white or pink, and they're always, there's always a need for white or pink in the floral design world. Katie said if I could pick 5, then 5 is hard too, but if I was to add to those 3 that I gave you, I personally love the Monarda, the spotted bee balm a lot. And Itea is my other personal favorite, but any of them, they're all really, really great. So yeah, you can definitely plant along fence lines for sure. And Katie asked, do I plant milkweed? I have not intentionally planted milkweed, but there's loads of milkweed around my farm in the meadow area that I have. So I have I'll scroll back real fast, try not to make you all dizzy. Whoop, here. So there's a huge meadow over here on the right of my field, and that is full of milkweed. So, but milkweed, I've tested it to be a cut, and it hasn't really held up that well as a cut. So it doesn't have a lot of value in that capacity, but amazing value for the other stuff. Oh, I see Mary Beth leaving. So I just said bye, Mary Beth. Okay, so all right. I think, are there any other questions? You guys can also unmute yourselves and say hi or anything if you want. I always like hearing people's voices more than just staring at a screen and stuff. So, but if anybody has any final remaining questions, I'm happy to take them before we sign off.
Hi, Jenny. Myself. Hi.
Hi, guys. Hi. I love seeing everyone. Any remaining questions?
Sure you don't have any, Scotty?
I'm sure I do, but
Yeah.
That's all right. I've been rambling, so.
Hey, I've got one. Are you familiar with passion flower? Or we call them maypops down here?
Yep.
We have
they make
them
great
all.
cuts.
Okay. Do they because I've noticed, like, when I gave my mom some when we bought the farm, we've got like a hedge of that stuff.
Ooh.
And when she transplanted it, everything died off of it, and it came back beautifully. The roots, you about can't get rid of them. But the flowers, I'm not sure how fast it went away. You say that makes a decent cut? The flower will last longer?
So the flowers are good for a short while. So like to do in wedding designs would be okay. But what is really great, you can sell to a florist, is they create, if it's the same kind of passion flower I'm familiar with, they create a like a sort of round green seed fruit thingy.
Yeah, the maypop.
Yeah. So that does well. Wedding florists in particular would probably love to have that to play with in, big installation kind of things. So I would try marketing that to some florists personally if I were you. If you've got loads of it, give it a shot.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Good consideration.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right.
Does anybody else have any questions for Jenny? This is Katie with CFSA. I know I asked a million, and I, like Scotty, could ask a million more, but I wanted to give other people the opportunity.
That's all right. Yeah.
Ashley, you got any questions? I know Ashley's super into perennials as well.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I love growing perennials. They're just it's the long haul. I don't farm my garden, so I'm very invested in making sense of the space that I have, and it's also hard because I rent. So I have a lot of growing perennials in pots and digging them up and replanting them. But suffice to say, I'm like very intrigued of my one-day property having something like this. I've really like fantasized about that. So I really appreciate like the no-till element coming in with perennials is a really beautiful intersection that I think a lot about. And I just appreciate your experience of how you got into this is like to protect and to provide food for nature is just really beautiful. So I really apprecited that. So
Oh, good. I'm glad.
I've got
yeah,
another.
of course. Oh yeah, go for it, Scotty.
Hey, we've got a field of broom sedge. Any thought? I mean, we used to make decorative brooms. Well, not decorative. My family used to use them as brooms, so we still make them from time to time, just decoratively now. But is there? Can you think of any floral value of the
Probably, yeah. Like in the fall, if you took that to a florist, they'd probably, or you can, you know, I don't know what your sales outlets are, but there's definitely, yeah, I would see that as a good, just it adds texture and interest to any design work for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Yeah, there's amazing stuff. Like nature's got all this cool stuff out there. A lot of these things I just stumbled on. These are not considered the crops that I presented here today are not necessarily considered crops for cut flower farmers even. Like they're I got curious about it and I would just go around and cut a stem off of this or a stem off of that and test it and see, does this really hold up? Does this have some value somehow? And then if it seemed like it was good, I started planting one of this, one of that, and then over time just evolved from there. So it's not like there's a book on this. There's no, I might write the book on this, but this is just sort of like curiosity leading the way over time. So definitely get out in the landscape and see what's out there. If something's growing wild and naturally and thriving in your space and you can, you know, work with that and sell it, then you might as well do that instead of shift the ecosystem and cause disturbance and everything for the sake of a crop. So yeah.
Jenny, I just want to say, it looks like we have a couple more questions, if you don't mind addressing them. And if we go a little over time, I think, Ashley, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think we're okay if we go a few minutes over.
Yeah, that's fine by me.
I just didn't want you to feel like you had to rush through it. That's all.
Thank you. Yeah, because I know there's like all this other presentation happening everywhere else. So yeah, let me jump over and see. Okay, here we go from Sarah. I see that you do a lot of planting in landscape fabric. How does that work with perennials that's spread over time? Do you enlarge the holes? Yeah. So I only use, for the record, I only use landscape fabric on perennials. I do not use it on annuals in my field. So when we first plant, so in this field in the picture here, when we first plant, we're planting very small little liner plants, like I said, from North Creek Nurseries or Spring Meadows, so they're really small. So we burn a small hole in the fabric that's just big enough to plant the plant into, because I don't want to end up having to weed a lot of extra soil. Obviously, you know, that's the whole point of the landscape fabric. But then a lot of these suckering plants like the Daravella or the Itea and so forth, as they get going, they want to run. So we do one of two things. We either go through the winter and burn bigger holes during the winter when everything's dormant and you can see the holes, so you can either burn a bigger hole or cut a bigger hole for them, or in many of the cases after 3 years we'll actually remove the landscape fabric and just let the perennial run and do what it wants to do, because many of these perennials would prefer to not have any boundaries, you know, like limitations like landscape fabric. And also landscape fabric can be really hard on soil ecosystems. You know, the soil would rather be exposed to organic matter, you know, leaves or mulch or wood chips or something. So having that plastic in between the soil and the organic matter can be really hard on it. So I like to actually get rid of landscape fabric once it's established. So the picture that I have up here on the screen, if you can see it well enough, this is a field that was planted in 2019. So it's still a young field. So it still has a fair amount of landscape fabric on it, but probably next year, a lot of this will get taken out. Because now we have control of the weeds, the ecosystem has shifted. Usually when you put new plants in and there's lots of weeds, it's because you're trying to insert something new into an established space. But once you get it established, then you don't have to fight nearly as hard. So that was a good question. Kendra said, I plan to read your blog, Jenny, but if there aren't any more questions, could you briefly speak about the no-till dahlia concept? Yeah, definitely. Let me just double check. Make sure I don't, awesome, cool. So yes, I'm happy to talk about the no dig dahlia concept. So basically, here behind me on the screen is what dahlias look like at my farm when they're in bloom, but then once frost comes, they die very quickly from frost. And so once they've been hit by a hard frost, we cut down the plants at the base. We do what's called chop and drop. So we're just going to cut all the foliage and let it drop to the ground so that it can decompose there and nourish those plants again the coming year. So once everything's chopped down, then we go back and cover that, the dahlia beds, with about 8 to 12 inches of leaves. So just deciduous brown leaves. Everybody's collecting them this time of the year anyway, here around Philadelphia, so it's super easy to do. You could also use straw if you don't have easy access to leaves. But the goal is to get some organic material that's light and fluffy so it will trap air in the pockets between the space. So don't use compost. You can put compost on your dahlias for sure, but compost isn't the right thing for this application. So it's either leaves or straw or something really fluffy. And then once you've covered the dahlias in that, then you pull tarps over top of that. So big, heavy tarps or impermeable tarps. And that's how the dahlias stay warm and dry over the winter. So the fluffy stuff, the leaves or the straw, are insulation. And that's why you want the air in it. And then the tarps are the roof that's keeping the rain off of it. So dahlias are actually very cold hardy. The tubers are very cold hardy, generally speaking, when they're in the ground, but what tends to kill them is moisture. So if they get wet and cold, just like a potato that gets wet and cold, it will rot out in the ground. So if you can keep the moisture off of them, then and some insulation, generally speaking, they do superbly in ground, and it's a very easy way to put your dahlias to bed that takes a lot less work than digging them all up, washing them all off, dividing them all, putting them in boxes or crates or whatever, putting them in storage, checking on them all winter, eventually getting them back out, planting them all again. You do all that stuff happens, like you skip all of that, and then you have more dahlias, happier dahlias, and they're more productive in the springtime. So we actually start harvesting dahlias in early June here, versus if we planted them as an annual, we wouldn't start harvesting until late August. So it gives us several more weeks of production. And I do believe the soil life is I know the soil life is much happier, but one of the things that I've started to understand about dahlias is that I think they rely heavily on those sort of connected relationships with microbial life. So with mycelium and with other bacteria, because they have huge tubers, but they don't have the best root system. So I think they really rely on the mycelium to go out and get stuff for them. And so whenever you dig up tubers, and especially when you dig them up and you scrub them off, and then you put them in storage for months where they dry out, like all of that life dies. And then according to studies and books that I've read, it takes 90 days to get soil biology to pair back up and be active with a plant. So in the spring, you plant them in the ground. Well, it's going to take 3 months until that soil life comes back, attaches, and starts doing its thing again. Well, guess what? Like that's like half the growing season. So you've just lost half the growing season. And I think that's the, I started growing my dahlias as perennials because frankly, I was a lazy farmer and I was like, screw dahlias, I hate you guys, you suck. Like that's sort of literally what I said to them. So I was like, I don't care if you die. But now I'm starting to understand like this is the real power of the system because my dahlias are so healthy and so resilient to really bad weather. And I'm 100% sure that's because of the microbial connections, even more so than that they're perennial. But I do, they have to be perennial to have the microbial connections. So it's all a big ball. But I encourage you guys, if you're growing dahlias, to make them perennials if you can. So yes, and I have a long blog post about it.
That's music to my ears. I don't know if anybody else, I'm sure most of us follow Florette on Instagram, like who doesn't, who's interested in flowers, but yeah, here watching their show and being on Instagram and seeing how they have to dig all these tubers up. I'm like, I'm never planting dahlias. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to think about it. So hearing you say this, I feel like a whole world of possibilities has opened up to me. And I'm very excited to try it on our farm and see what happens.
Good. Yeah, do.
So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
Ooh,
yeah.
Video. We have another attendee joining via video. That's awesome.
Yay.
Do you find with your no-dig dahlias that they kind of quit on you earlier because they're blooming earlier?
No, not at all. A lot of people have asked me that question, and I have not experienced that at all. In fact, they become even more productive. They have a lull in August, like all dahlias do, because dahlias are a C3 plant, which means once the temperature gets over 80 degrees, they shut down. They can't photosynthesize. That's the way a lot of plants are in our world here. There's another kind of plant called a C4 plant. That's plants that grow in the tropics, but we're not growing a lot of C4 plants as crops. So like all other C3 plants, dahlias are going to shut down when it gets super, super hot, but they're not shutting down because they're being perennialized. They're shutting down just because it's so freaking hot. So there is a lull, but then come September, they're just like we cut, I mean, it's an insane amount of stems that we're cutting in September from these plants that have been blooming since June. So yep, I don't see any slowdown from them at all.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, of course, good question.
This is awesome. I'm so glad that people put their questions in towards the end. If anybody has any other questions, now is your chance. Otherwise, we're gonna let everyone grab some lunch soon before the next session.
Yeah. I hope this talk at least inspires some people to consider flowers. If you haven't had flowers on your farm before, they really can bring so much to the equation. It's like I hear all the time about how people are like, you have to have livestock on your farm to have a whole farm system, which is hard for me to have livestock here because I'm in the city. There's so many limitations, but I would say the same with flowers. You can't have a whole farm system until you have flowers in your cycle as well. So there's some very specific flower crops that you can add that aren't so hard, and I wouldn't necessarily say turn around and become like a flower farmer while you're also a veggie farmer or a rancher or whatever. But it is worth dedicating a certain space to flowers, if only to bring a complete ecosystem to your farm.
Yeah, you're totally right. I know I'm excited to do more perennials on our farm. I'm sure a lot of other people are too. It looks like Scotty has a final question on wax myrtles, if you would be willing to share some thoughts.
I don't know wax myrtles. Is that a southern thing? I don't know what that plant is. I feel bad. I could Google it real quick. It might be something that I just don't know that name, like regional names. I'll do a quick search.
You're putting her on the spot, Scotty.
I know. It's not often I get stumped. So let me see.
It looks like Scotty just said that they're native to North Carolina.
Yeah. But it's an evergreen. I'm looking at pictures here. It looks to me like it would work. That's oh yeah. Actually, I think this is one that's used in the floral community. What do we call it though? Something olive, I feel like. That looks great. I would definitely
autumn olive?
Maybe, I don't know. But I would definitely use that.
I know they along the coast you see them a lot where the salt will prune them when it blows in up there at Fort Fisher, and they're I mean you see them a lot along the coast, but we've grown from sprigs here, you know, around our residence as a hedge. But they've supposedly they used to use them the berries for making some kind of wax, and the brush off of them was supposed to be mosquito repellent, and the
nice.
was fragrant. But I
yeah.
was just wondering if you're familiar with it.
I'm not, but I'm looking at pictures of this, and I 100% as a floral designer would be all about that, because it looks like it would hold up well out of water because it's kind of waxy, which is like the golden, you know, ticket for floral design, is anything that won't wilt out of water. Makes it very, very valuable to florists. So I would cut some of that and take it to florists if I was you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it looks great. I want some. Try to have to find it.
Come on down from next time you're in Philly.
All right. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Well, we're gonna end the session. Thank you so much, Jenny. We really appreciate you being here. This was a phenomenal session. Thank you, everyone, for participating and sharing your questions. And we hope you guys have a great rest of your conference.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks, guys.